In Syria, evidence collected by United Nations investigators probing Syrian war crimes implicate President Bashar al-Assad. The United Nations investigators, who collected testimony in utmost secrecy, have previously said the evidence points to the highest levels of Syria's government, but have not named Assad or any other officials publicly. They have compiled secret lists of suspects for safe storage in hope that one day suspects will face trial for violations, including torture and mass killings.
They have now been extended 3 times. They've produced massive evidence. So, they find the facts. Based on that, in their report, they've outlined their view that the facts point to the commission of very serious crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity. They point to the fact that the evidence indicates responsibility at the highest level of government, including the head of state.
In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood has rejected Egypt's new draft constitution. Their group said abusive coupists were trying to distort Egypt's legitimate constitution, adopted under ousted President Mohamed Morsi last year. The Constituent Assembly began voting to approve the draft of a new constitution that will bolster the military's hand and ban religious parties. The constitution, expected to be put to a referendum in December, is part of an army-planned political transition apparently meant to lead to parliamentary and presidential elections next year. In Lebanon, the army will now take control of the capital, Tripoli, after serious clashes killed 10 people in 2 days. According to the Prime Minister, the army will be in control for 6 months. The weekend's fights were sparked by divisions over the conflict in Syria. The city's Sunni Muslims largely support Syria's opposition, while the Alawati population tend to favor President Bashar al-Assad. Clashes broke out on Saturday, leaving at least 6 dead. On Sunday, at least 4 people were hit by sniper fire. In Thailand, anti-government protests continue to escalate. Police has fired tear gas and protesters have responded throwing rocks and improvised explosives. Today, demonstrators managed to enter the government house. They gathered on the lawn of the Prime Minister Shinawatra office, waving flags and taking photos. In Japan, the parliament of Naha, capital of Okinawa Prefecture, has voted against the relocation of a US military base in the city. It was the first time that Naha City expressed the opposition by resolution, protesting the Japanese central government's plan to transfer Futenma Air Base. The relocation plan has been opposed by both the Okinawa Prefecture's government and local residents. In Venezuela, a power blackout launched the capital and other cities into darkness. The country has been suffering periodic electricity cuts for several years, but the capital has been spared the worst problems. At the time, the President Maduro was in the middle of giving a speech that was interrupted. The president found it strange and suggested sabotage.
It is a strange blackout because we have increased to almost 2,000 megawatts. That is more than what we had 7-8 months ago. I have been saying this, that there were going to be new attacks against our power grid. I put the country and the world on alert. I have all security teams of the state and of the armed forces on alert to protect the people. Here it is, sabotage against the power grid live and direct at 10:54. Our noble people do not deserve this from a fascist right wing.
In Ukraine, the recent protests may cause an economic shutdown in the country. The warning comes from the Prime Minister, who said the opposition is attacking illegitimate leadership. Demonstrators want a deeper integration with Europe and to revive economic ties with Russia.
People are being directed to capture government buildings, to block the work of government institutions, to put forward ultimatums. It's a path leading to nowhere.
The United Nations senior counterterrorism official is to launch an investigation into the surveillance powers of American and British intelligence agencies following Edward Snowden's revelations that they are using secret programs to store and analyze billions of emails, phone calls and text messages. The inquiry would also seek to establish whether the British Parliament had been misled about the capabilities of Britain's government communications headquarters and whether the current system of oversight and scrutiny was strong enough to meet United Nations standards.
Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. The first round of voting has just finished in the Chilean presidential race. Centre-left candidate Michelle Bachelet is the clear victor. She faces a tumultuous year. Inequality and political disillusionment are rife in a country still trying to come to terms with its turbulent past. And in the international arena, Latin America has been at the forefront of a conflict between globalisation and the interests of the mass of working and poor people. Populist left-wing governments have challenged economic orthodoxy in much of the continent. So where will Chile figure in this puzzle after the elections? Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Dr. Monica Threlfall, a reader at the Institute for the Study of European Transformations, Nina Lopez from Legal Action for Women, and on Skype we're joined by Dr. Kristina Manny, Associate Professor in the Politics Department of Oberlin University. But first, here's Alex MacDonald with this report.
Michelle Bachelet, the left-wing candidate in Chile's presidential elections, has overwhelmingly won the first round of voting, polling nearly twice as high as her nearest rival, Oberlin Matai. Although she did not manage to win an outright majority, meaning a second round of voting will take place on the 15th of December, it has already been hailed as a decisive victory. Since the restoration of democracy in 1990, Chile's political scene has been dominated by the legacy of Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship. This election has been no exception. The two candidates, Bachelet and Mattia, were originally childhood friends and their fathers both served together in the Chilean Air Force. But while Bachelet's father became a member of Salvador Allende's leftist government, Mattai's father worked under Augusto Pinochet after he overthrew Allende's government in a 1973 CIA-backed coup. Bachelet's father was soon after tortured to death in Pinochet's jails for opposing the coup. Bachelet had previously been president between 2006 and 2010 and had left office with high popularity ratings. Now she looks set to secure an unprecedented second term as president of the country, although her victory comes on the back of much political turmoil. For the last 2 years, Chile has been rocked by street protests, primarily by students opposing the privatization of the education system, but also expressing discontent at an economic and political system they feel is no longer representing them. Although economists have praised Chile's booming growth, which has turned it into one of the wealthiest countries in South America, the neoliberal economic system has also resulted in one of the widest gaps between rich and poor in the world.
We have been emphatic in saying that the only solution will be on the streets with protests. That's why we're doing this. We are saying goodbye to the current government with a protest, and we are going to welcome the new government with protests.
Although Bachelet has promised to be more radical this term than she was in her previous term, leading a coalition of socialists, social democrats and communists, there will be pressure on her from the student movement. Several former leaders of the movement during her original presidency have found themselves elected to Congress with the promise to take the message of their original protests into the parliamentary sphere.
We, as the Communist Party, will do what we have always done and will continue doing. We are going to continue working in the street with social organisations, with union organisations, students. We have always been and will continue being part of the social movement and student movements too. This will not decrease the possibility of having an effect in the places where decisions are made.
It gives me tremendous satisfaction to see that leaders that have emerged from the student movement or the social movements will be in Parliament in March. It gives me great satisfaction to see that despite the obstacles, it is possible that new faces can come to Parliament. Because Chile needs good policy, Chile needs citizen representatives close to those who play for the changes our country demands.
Bachelet has been campaigning on a promise to reduce Chile's enormous wealth gap. Although she is expected to secure an easy victory in the December runoff, there will be many challenges facing her, particularly from a highly politicised student movement, which is going to be keeping a close watch on her every move. Alex MacDonald, Islam Channel.
So, Nina, we saw there in the package that there's some considerable history running back to the years of the Allende government and the Pinochet coup here. How much is the past structuring the debate in Chile, in modern Chile?
Hugely. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, and I think it's in fact been very good to see how the students have little by little realized how much their movement was a rejection of the past, and a lot of them don't want just against capitalism altogether, and they see capitalism as the legacy of Augusto Pinochet. And I think also, don't forget that there's the movements of the mothers and the relatives of the disappeared, mainly women who have carried on campaigning all these decades and have never gone away and are still there demanding justice. And the whole issue of justice is a huge demand in Chile, as all over Latin America and many other places.
Dr. Threlfall, I mean, your institute in London Metropolitan University studies this, but also you were there at the time of the coup, weren't you?
Yes, I was. I went to Chile in beginning of 1972, and therefore I spent nearly 2 years there. And I got a job working in shantytowns, interviewing shantytown leaders in the area of La Florida, part of Santiago, the Comuna La Florida, and also the heads of women's centers, Centros de Madres. So I got a pretty good bottom-up view of what things were like there.
And do you agree with Nina that this is still an important element that's structuring political debate in Chile now?
Yes, I think in some ways we've come full circle. If you look at the Concertación as a very extended transition government in some way, attempting to be moderate and not to scare business and so on. And we have the same parties, but I mean, they came up pretty quickly, and that is fairly normal in transitions. I mean, the same happened in Spain. The same old parties from the 1930s can just pop up again. And you need parties, and you need parties with a history and with roots, and with, you know, with people in them who remember the past and so on and have learnt the lessons. So I see this as a normalization, though. I don't see it as something dangerous or in any way challenging the fundamental system. You
mean a normalisation in the sense that
political normalisation.
That whereas at the time there was a kind of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary moment, this has now become a kind of tradition within traditions within a democratic polity. Is that your point?
Yes, I don't think the Allende government was revolutionary. After all, it was elected. It's the definition of revolutionary, that you give up on democracy and you take power by other means. So that wasn't the case. But it did, of course, want to challenge capitalism much more than the left does nowadays. So in that sense, it was more radical, and the Chilean government and the previous one, the previous two, the Conservatives and the Concertación, have been capitalist governments. They're just, you know, making capitalism have a human face. And there's a lot more to do on that front, and a lot more that's possible to do. So I see it as an optimistic moment.
You know, I think it's a lot more open than that. I mean, we just don't know. I think Bachelet is certainly not a revolutionary. Bachelet hardly did much of anything when she was in power, and I think a lot of people in her first term of office, I think a lot of people were extremely disappointed with her. I was part of a conference just now about 40 years since the Pinochet coup with a whole set of Chilean exiles, and there were one more disappointed than the other in relation to Bachelet. Of course, it was, of course, between Bachelet and the right wing, there was no choice. But I think the fact that there is a very strong student movement, I think that the fact that there is a very strong indigenous Mapuche movement, I think they're going to press these so-called Democrats into maybe doing something this time.
Well, let me bring Dr. Manny into the conversation on exactly that point. Some of the leaders of the recent student movement indeed have been candidates in the elections. Is this an attempt to refresh and re-establish the credentials with the left, do you think?
I think that the leaders of the student movement, many, such as Camila Vallejo, who just won a seat in the lower house, they are not anti-system in any way. They very much are, I think, grassroots democratic in principle, and they, however, reject sort of the established institutions. And the institutions, very importantly, were determined in a constitution that was written in 1980 at the high point of the dictatorship. Was pushed through in a plebiscite that has, you know, many questions about how legitimate it was. The voter rolls had been destroyed and so forth. And so a fundamental legacy of the dictatorship that is sort of the anchor of the past, the institutional anchor of the past, is that constitution. Bachelet in the elections, although it was a first round for the presidential election, the parliament was established in that election a couple of weeks ago, and she has, you know, moderate coattails. But as your other commentators were noting, that there is a strong social movement, and that is really fundamentally anti-party. Social movements are by definition not party organizations that are, part of the establishment. They exist to call into question existing policies and existing political carriers. And so it's interesting that the student representatives, or the representatives, the face of the student movement, has decided to play the political game and associate themselves with parties, with new parties, with the Communist Party. But they will be a constant challenge to both the president and the majority that she has constructed with her coattails in both houses.
Well, Nina, I mean, you were pointing out in your first contribution about the role that women have played historically in the Chilean struggle, and the new parental law, which was implemented in October last year, is considered to be one of the biggest achievements for the government, and yet the participation rate of women in the workforce 10% lower in Chile than it is in Latin America as a whole. Do you think this is one source of a radical challenge, a bit like the students are to the government, a kind of, you know, encouragement for it to move to the left in the second term?
Well, you know, there's different aspects to the women's movement. There's no question that women among the students, for example, have been very prominent. I mean, Chile, the church traditionally has been very strong in Chile. On the other hand, the social movements, the human rights movement, have been absolutely women-led in Chile, as in Argentina, where I come from, as in many other, everywhere in the world, really. It's women who do that kind of justice work. And it's really part of the caring work that women do. You know, you give birth, you want your children to do well, and when something terrible happens to them, you fight for justice. And that leadership that women have given, I think, goes throughout. Now, in terms of women in the so-called workforce, I mean, that's really a mixed bag, because even in this country where women have gone very heavily into the workforce, many women feel they have been forced into the workforce. They have been forced to give up their families in order to prove their worth and to really compete on men's terms. So we don't see that necessarily as a proof that things are getting better. I think everything that women do, starting with the caring work, has to be recognized. And I think if Bachelet did more of that, then women would be in a much better position to decide how much in the workforce we want to be and on what terms.
Yes, I particularly would agree the fact that, for instance, it's quite easy to recognize some of women's work, for instance, in terms of national social contributions, or also, for instance, in pensions records. It would just be a bureaucratic exercise. But the world over, we have a situation really only since the 20th century where it is incompatible for a woman to earn her living and create life. And without the creation of life, obviously we can't continue, and nor can the next workforce. So that kind of contradiction, which is really structural, has to be addressed. And the parental leave is one attempt to suggest that men can also be parents, and that both men and mothers and fathers can take some time off work in between birth, which would be, maternity leave, and the beginning of school, which can be 3 or 5, depending on what country.
Have we any indication of what the impact of that has been, or is it too soon to tell?
I think it's too soon, because it's very slow, and usually the whole European trends is that it's always taken by women, and the men are afraid for the first decade or so to be seen at work to say, oh, hello, I'm going to take time off in order to spend more time with my children or be the main carer for a while. This takes a very long time.
But there have been, there's students in particular, but I think the population generally agrees that there should be a new constitution in Chile, and that's definitely one thing that they're going to be fighting about. And constitutions have changed many things in Latin America. They have in Venezuela. Venezuela under Chavez, and I do think we have to give credit to Chavez for being the first to change the climate in Latin America. You know, people used to laugh at Chavez when he said some of the things that he did say, and then later on began to say it themselves and to join with Venezuela. And the Venezuelan constitution recognizes the caring work that women do in the home, you know, as being productive. They recognize it as being productive and deserving a wage for a housewife, even though it hasn't been properly implemented. Ecuador has some recognition similar to that. Bolivia also. So
and
there is,
but European countries too.
Not exactly.
GDP,
no,
yes.
Well, GDP is not
satellite
the constitution.
accounts to
Yes,
GDP.
satellite accounts.
Oh, I see. Sorry,
is
I thought
good,
you meant the constitution.
but it's nothing like saying it's productive and you should get paid for it. That's a very different story. So we hope that there's going to be some major changes along those lines as well.
Dr. Manny, do you think that what we're likely to see here is that the impact of some of the leaders of the student movement, some of the women leaders of the student movement, is that actually going to move the government to the left, or are they going to be subject to incorporation? Will they simply provide a kind of more radical face for a government which hasn't really changed direction very much?
Well, I think that Bachelet, and we generally are assuming that she will win the second round because she had such strong support in the first round. Her legacy in this second term will depend on how responsive she is to social movement pressures. If she truly stands for the social program reforms, education reforms, more progressive tax system that would pay for these kinds of costs, if she really stands for these things, she's going to have to implement them in policy, and maybe not a constitutional reform. That seems out of reach because you would need 2/3 majorities in both houses of the parliament for that. So a fundamental transformation of the system is unlikely, and there's nothing that she can do about that. But yes, she will have to step up on the other issues. And I think as one of the student leaders who recently was elected said, you know, we'll have one foot in the street and one foot in the parliament. That's how, you know, we're on both sides of this. We are not letting go of our movement aspect.
Well, what do you make of the low turnout? Because I mean, below 50%. It looks as if perhaps, as indeed in this country, the actual attraction of establishment politics is not very great, even though participation in extra parliamentary movements has been rising over the last decade.
Well, the attraction of the establishment is at historic lows for Chile in the democratic period. Polls recently gave numbers that about 80% of the population doesn't feel an affinity to any political party, and about 70% don't approve of the way that Congress has been behaving. Well, that's probably a trend globally, and at least in democracies. Those kinds of disaffections, I think, help to explain why in the first round there wasn't a stronger turnout. I think in the second round, you might see some more turnout. The first round was kind of also an assumption that, well, Bachelet will likely win it. So this is also the first time that Chile doesn't have mandatory voting. And there we're seeing a little bit of an impact of that, I think. But I think you will see turnout. And it will be both at the polls and continued on the streets.
How do you read that, Nina? Because I mean, in a way, it looks as if
the low turnout.
Yeah, it looks as if the student leaders are stepping into establishment politics when perhaps a large section of their supporters are stepping out of interest.
Well, I think that has something to do with Bachelet not having been an inspiring president when she won in the first round, and I think that generally people are very disillusioned with politics because you feel, and that's a global phenomenon. I think what the other woman said is right, because you feel you elect people, they come in, they have a platform, some of them that's half reasonable. As soon as they get in, they just completely give up, like happened with the Lib Dems here with the student fees, just to mention one example. But I think that has been a big problem. I think there are countries where that has not been a trend. I think Venezuela has been one, but then Chavez got a huge amount of support from the population. I think Haiti has been another, where President Aristide also got a huge amount of support from the population because people felt really represented. I think when people feel that they are going to be represented and that they are going to be themselves involved in the process, which is what Venezuela has uniquely done, as well as Haiti before the coup, then you get a very different engagement.
I mean, the comparison with Venezuela tells us quite a lot, because I mean that was an electoral process which was embedded in a much more broader and a much more radical social process. This perhaps not so much.
I'd like to point out a couple of anomalies. Michelle Bachelet left office with the highest approval ratings of any president, 70%. So obviously that reflects on how people viewed her term positively. Secondly, the fall in turnout may be the result of the fact that before, registration was very low. Therefore, of those who were registered, of course, the turnout was actually very high. It's also very high, up to, in some periods, up to 87%. Whereas
so what was involved in the registration? Let's take a step back, because that's quite an interesting point. So what was involved in the registration process? If you're saying...
Well, if you have to do it in a complicated way, you have to go and sign on and so on. So they introduced a new system where you're automatically registered on the basis of your identity card. And then, I don't know why, because because I haven't researched it, how that happened. Then you're then told where you can go and vote. But still, there's some work done in between. So the point is that now, as you have a far higher percentage of the population registered, obviously your turnout is going to look comparatively low. So we have to, that's called quite technical elections. One shouldn't run away with it.
And is there a kind of, is there a kind of backwash from the previous compulsory thing that people say, oh, I've been
No, it's still compulsory, and they just think now, but people didn't do it. They didn't, so there's no point in, because you can't prosecute somebody. So, and in terms of extra parliamentary politics, that's, I think, is healthy and it's a very European phenomenon. It's
I'm going to have to stop you there, because we're running out of time for the first half, but we will be continuing our discussion of what the elections in Chile mean and the situation more generally in Latin America. So do rejoin us after the break for the second part of analysis.